So in our next segment, we're going to hear a really unique perspective from someone many of us know from television, movies, social media. This gentleman is also deeply immersed in tech and how it can be used to change the world for good. Now I'm talking about, of course, Ashton Kutcher, and I am not punking you, he is backstage. He, however, has punked hundreds of the biggest stars in showbiz. His IMDb profile is stacked with credits as an actor, producer. That 70s show, of course, 2.5 Men, What Happens in Vegas, The Butterfly Effect, and he also co-produces and stars in the Netflix original series The Ranch, which is great, by the way. He has tremendous clout in Hollywood. Now, Ashton is also a successful investor. He's an entrepreneur, and especially in the tech space. 2011, he co-created a venture fund, A-Grade Investments, which helped to launch some startups you may or may not have heard about: Airbnb, Spotify, Uber, Oscar Health, Warby Parker, just to mention a few of the smaller ones. He's also been named one of the most influential people in the world by such publications as Time and Vanity Fair. He's one of the world's most powerful celebrities, according to Forbes, and one of the Fast Company magazine's most creative people. Ashton is also the co-founder of Thorn, Digital Defenders of Children, which drives technology innovation to fight the sexual exploitation of children. So, are you ready? Let's do this. Let's give a nice big partner world welcome to the one, the only, Mr. Ashton Kutcher.
Hello. Oh, that was a little loud, wasn't it? Sorry. I apologize.
So here we are. How you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Glad to have you here. We're thrilled to have you here at Partner World. Tech, a big deal. You've been investing for 10 years, give or take, right?
Yeah, probably 15 years. So I started. I started personally investing, and then when I started running out of money, I took other people's money to invest.
Wise strategy. So in those 10/15 years, what's changed in your strategy?
I think the strategy is always changing. When I first started investing, I honestly didn't know what I was doing. I still am not 100% sure I know what I'm doing. And I think that's probably been the one thing that's been consistent.
Does it help to not necessarily have that sort of predetermined structure?
Yeah, I think a lot of the guardrails people build for themselves actually put them into boxes where they're not allowed to actually find true innovation or invest in true innovation, because they've created some, if it hasn't worked before, we shouldn't do this, or if that way has failed historically, let's not even go near it. But the truth is that usually innovation happens on the edges. I think the biggest thing that I've probably changed over time is I used to look for technologies that I thought were innovative and then try to find consumer or business applications for those technologies, as opposed to today. Is I realize that you're much better off actually finding existing human behaviors and then trying to identify technology that fits that human behavior and makes it either faster, more efficient, more cost effective. And I oftentimes find entrepreneurs that have some brilliant technical innovation and they're like hunting for a solution, as opposed to go and look for problems and then find the technology that fills the solution.
Feels like there's a bit more of an organic base to do that.
Yeah. I think another thing I've learned is like the difference between confidence and cockiness, like when trying to identify high quality founders. I think that's changed. I think my approach towards finding diverse founders has changed. I mean, I used to look for products that applied to the N of one, that one being me. And I realized that I had a really high concentration of male-founded companies, and I realized that, I had a giant blind spot here because I didn't have domain expertise in products that were more inclined for a female audience. So I brought on a female partner onto my fund to help sort of fill that blind spot. And since we've done that, we've actually increased the number of female-founded companies we've invested in by, I think, 30% at this point.
Very cool. That's very cool. So it sounds like at the foundation of this is to make sure that expectations, you don't go in with such predetermined expectations that it sort of locks you in.
Yeah, I think it's almost better to have you have to have enough knowledge, but then enough naivete to any given market in order to create innovation.
So, which leads beautifully into my next question, which is, as an actor, people have, I would guess, expectations of you around, the characters that you've played. You've played diverse characters, but when we
you mean dumb characters?
No, no, eccentric, charismatic. But those characters, I'm curious how that affects the initiation of those relationships. Do people come in with those expectations, and can that be helpful?
I think early on when I was investing, people rightfully sort of pigeonholed me as like a celebrity investor because they didn't know. And I think over time in at least in the Silicon Valley ecosystem, people understand that I kind of know what I'm doing to some degree, and more than that, am willing to put myself out there and be really helpful to the companies I invest in. But for me, as long as people return the call, I feel like the rest is up to me to do the work to convince them that I can add value to what they're trying to build.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you've had a string of some great investments with Uber, with Spotify. What would you say of those big successes? What do they have in common? What's the common ground?
I think they're all really different. But I would start with the founders of the companies, the CEOs of the companies. They all had some extraordinary domain expertise or some way of looking at the world that was entirely different from other folks. I think the founders of Airbnb came in. They went to RISD and they were art students. So their way of looking at travel was through an entirely different lens of appreciation for culture and art. And the founder of Uber had multiple startups beforehand and had extraordinary domain expertise. So I think that's probably one thing. And then they all had this certain level of grit that you could tell that they were willing to overcome whatever obstacle might come as a founder in order to accomplish what they were accomplishing. But I think the bigger thing that they all have in common, if you look at Airbnb, Spotify, and Uber as prime examples, they weren't changing the consumer behavior, right? People travel. Yeah. They were traveling. They were already traveling. People take cabs or black cars. That was already happening. People listen to music. That was already happening. What they really innovated on, and none of those companies really invented some extraordinary technology. It's not like Uber put the GPS in the phone to allow for you to signal a car as to where you are. They just took the existing technologies that were in the landscape, and utilized them for an existing consumer behavior and made it cheaper, more efficient, faster, and more pleasant. Right. And I think that's probably the biggest commonality that all those companies have.
Yeah. And I actually want to go back to what you said about the Airbnb folks being art students. For yourself as an artist, how does that cross over to the investor, what you've learned as an artist or an actor?
I think as an actor, you deconstruct characters that you play, and you deconstruct them by by trying to assess what their want is. Mm-hmm. Or there's a great acting coach named Larry Moss. He always talks about super objective and then your objectives that live underneath your super objectives. And so you're always studying the character that you're playing, and by doing so, you're studying people, and then you're studying human behaviors. Right. And one of the things that you study with characters is you try to create repetitious behaviors that become character traits. And anytime you have an absolute repetition in behavior, you should be able to automate it. And so that's when I think the technology layer folds in. So as we look at the various things that people do every single day, the daily behaviors of humans, and a lot of times people are doing things the hard way, and they're kind of hacking some system. And when technology comes in and it goes, oh, actually we can automate these steps in the process and thereby make it easier for that behavior to exist, and therefore give you time back as a person. And I think if we all look at our baseline wants, they're very similar, right? Like it's like the Maslow hierarchy of needs. And at the end of that pyramid is we want to have room to love. And so if you can take things that we don't love off the table by automating them so that we can more quickly get to the things that we do love, the relationships that we care about, the people that we care about, that's the sort of magic of the whole puzzle. And I think that's how the two fit together.
This would have been very useful to me to hear in my 20s when I was dating all the time. Get the old stuff out. So it's, yeah, it really sounds like at the basis of your philosophy is the organic, keeping it organic, because that ultimately will lead to a more efficiency. Now, there's all kinds of new technologies on the horizon. What are things that may not be on our radar yet that you're jazzed about?
So inside that very question lives the thing that I've learned the most, which is don't chase the technology, chase the behavior. I think there's super interesting stuff all around. I think, NFC is, starting to be inside of all of our pockets, and I think the utilization of that is, I think it's relatively underutilized at this point, and I think that you'll see an acceleration in that. There's some new technology from a company called Radar that's figured out how to do RFID for inventory management, like down to 4x4, 6x6, which is, that stuff's gonna be pretty cool. There's a bunch of stuff in biotech that I think is phenomenal. There's a company that created synthetic palm oil. So if you think about the amount of destruction that happens in the world from an environmental perspective from palm oil production, being able to eliminate that by creating synthetic palm oil would be extraordinary. On my way here, I was connecting with the founder of a company called Verge Genomics that's using a lot of machine learning and AI to actually understand multiple biomarkers that can relate to various drugs that already exist that we can utilize for various other outcomes. So some of that stuff is extraordinary. I think the potential of machine vision and machine learning, I don't even think we've started to hit stride with that stuff yet. So I think there are a lot of technologies that people probably already know about, but that aren't being utilized to their full capacity to optimize for happiness of humans.
Right, expanding on that need for efficiency and those human needs. So, I know when we think about tech startups, we imagine, a bunch of folks in their garage, 4 in the morning, eating Doritos and doing their, their work on this small budget. Where do you see the role, of a large company like IBM in that stratosphere? The folks that are eating their Doritos in the day, say.
That's a great question. I think the biggest advantage that the large companies that have been around for a while have is they've made a lot of the early mistakes, and they probably have their data structured in a way that is more useful than a lot of startups. And they have a lot more structured data. And given the advances in AI, that structured data becomes super, super valuable because it's hard to train AI without highly structured data. So those robust data sets and the ability to actually train AI on it, I think is probably the largest strategic advantage. I think a lot of the larger companies have made the mistakes around security, or at least have the resources to actually apply to security that some early startups don't have. And I think that that's a giant advantage. I think they also have capital, which allow them to acquire innovation on the edges. Yeah. And I think that that's a giant advantage as well.
Cool. And we are getting down to the wire, but I want to ask you for sure to talk to us about Thorn. Tell us a bit about Thorn, and what does Thorn do, and how did that come about?
So, how did it come about? it's one of those problems in the world that I saw that existed. I saw a Dateline special where there were these children in Cambodia that were like 6 and 7 years old that were being raped for profit. And I was like, when I saw it, I was sort of shocked. And the means to actually identify the individuals that were doing this didn't seem to have any sophistication. It seemed like one of those problems in the world that existed that there wasn't a lot being done. Right. And then I came across some data that showed that like 70% of the transaction for child sex was happening online. And I thought, well, if people are using the internet and digital resources to facilitate these transactions, maybe we can use these same digital resources to find those individuals and or deter those individuals from the transaction themselves. And so I built a collective, and what we do now is we just basically defend the right for kids to be kids by eliminating sexual exploitation of children. So,
yeah.
So we built a bunch of tools that now allow us to do that more effectively, and it's scaling like any tech company scales that is successful. We've identified like 18,000 kids to date, and we just keep building and growing. And we're doing a bunch of stuff on the dark web and the open web. I don't really talk about it in detail. Yeah. But we have law enforcement all over the world that's now using it, and we're in all 50 states. And
amazing.
Building up.
Amazing. So, kids.
My favorite startup.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. For sure. You're a dad yourself. What do we, as am I, what, you know, I know for myself, thinking about raising my little girls in a world where, you know, social media is everywhere, where tech can be a great thing. It could be something used against children. What are the pitfalls? And what are the great things about tech that you consider when you're, you know, coming from that perspective as a dad?
So on the pitfalls, there's a dangerous thing that I think is happening in the world. That's a good thing and a dangerous thing. It's this call-out culture. If you've read anything that Jonathan Haidt's written, I think it's really dangerous. There's a social currency that people are trading, which is you see somebody who made a mistake currently or a mistake in the past or somebody who said something the wrong way, and we call them out, we malign them, we put them down, we disassociate from them, and it's a really dangerous thing because there's like social credit that gets built, and I think social media is really enabling that. And it's dangerous because there are mistakes that people made in the past, and they may have changed as human beings from the time that they made the mistake to now. And we can't really, it's hard for anybody to socially stand up for those individuals without then being maligned themselves for standing up for an individual. So I think that's a really dangerous thing that's happening, especially as I think about my kids. And if I think back to like some of the mistakes I made in high school, the things I had, the attitudes I had, the opinions I had, my perspective on the world, I came from, you know, there were some very racist people in my family that were very influential to me. There were people that didn't like gay people in and around my world that were very influential to me when I was young. And it wasn't until I traveled and got out in the world and saw people and met people and became more cultured that I realized that those were backwards ideas that I'd been fed as a kid. And so I think about my kids today and the potential ideas that their isolated ecosystem may feed them, but that the output of that may exist for infinity on the internet. And then 20 years from now, if this call-out culture continues, my kids could be called out for some backward idea that I gave them because I just wasn't cultured enough to know. So it pressures me as an individual to educate and enlighten myself as deeply as I can and share those ideas with them. It pressures me to keep them in an environment that keeps them having enlightened ideas so that someday their recorded comments aren't used to tear them down as individuals in the future. So that's scary to me. I think we need to think about that and how we as a culture treat and behave with one another. I think there's a great book I read called The Broken Ladder that talks about income inequality, and that talks about how the actual amount of income you have is less influential to you from an income inequality perspective as how you feel relative to other people. Are you making upward comparisons to the people that are more well off than you, or downward comparisons? And if you look at countries like Denmark, where it's relatively socioeconomically, equal, there's a lot of happiness, and people tend to do better in all kinds of quadrants, health and otherwise. And in highly socioeconomic, Iowa's a state in the United States that actually has high income equality. Whereas like if you look at Texas, which has high income inequality, there's a difference, and it's a reflection of the way people feel relative to the world around them, even more so than the actual amount of capital income people have, that affects things down to the point where when a girl gets her period is earlier if you feel like you're in a socioeconomically suppressed situation. Because it launches a fight or flight response within your system. And as humans, we're built over time to procreate. And so if you feel like you're in a survival mode and your body's always in survival mode, you get your period earlier in life, it turns out, according to this data in this book. So I look at that and I think about that relative to social media and the interconnectedness of the universe. And I think, was the Arab Spring enabled by people that had the internet, or was it also caused by social media in so much as suddenly people in the world had these variable upward comparisons that they were looking at and feeling more poor, even if they weren't more poor. And I think that we have to be aware of that in an Instagram world where people take pictures next to cars they don't even own to look like they're living the life.
Yeah.
Is that actually causing people to feel like they're not living the life and therefore are less happy as individuals and have all these downstream variable effects that are really systematically bad? So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about relative to the social media context and how to mitigate those things over time that are downsides. The upsides are obvious. I actually think the more cultured and connected we become as people, the better we become as people. And the more we realize that we're sort of in this all together. I think that's really powerful and valuable when we look at like some of the largest humanitarian threats like climate change, realizing that, we're all kind of alike in a lot of ways. And if we can drive our social use and social connectedness to understand how we're alike more, as opposed to driving it to see our differences, I think that could be a very powerful thing. I also think while social media is being used so that some governments can try to hijack the ideals of democracy, we can actually use it to bolster the ideals of democracy and weaponize it in a similar way to the way that it's being weaponized against us. We can weaponize it in a positive way. And so that's how I think about it.
Amazing. Well, yes, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much. It's very inspirational, I know, for all of us to hear your perspective and all the things that you're doing to use tech and social media in ways to bring people together and to affect positive change. So thank you so much.
Yeah, cheers. Thank you.
Ashton Kutcher, ladies and gentlemen, give it up.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Have fun.